So chapter 7 will be the beginning of inference, which is going to be the most important thing probably the most important thing that you learn in this class. So we're going to start by revisiting two definitions that you've seen before. The first one is population. So recall that the population is the entire group of individuals you want information about. So population, for example, can be all Americans, it can be all teenagers, it can be all students at our school. So the population is going to be a very, very broad category. Now, doing a survey or an experiment with the entire population is really, really impractical. So usually what we do is we actually will take a sample. And a sample is the subset of the population from whom we actually collect data. So for example, if you read about a poll in the news, usually they're trying to represent all adult Americans. However, they can't go around asking every single adult American because there's millions of them. So generally what they'll do is they will take a sample. They'll get a smaller group. So we also have two new definitions, which are parameter and statistic. And a parameter is going to be a number that describes a population. So this number can be a mean, it can be a percent. You'll see a few different things. It can just be a proportion, but so the one thing I want you to remember is parameter and population both start with P, so they go together. Also, you'll notice that statistic and sample both start with S, and those are going to be the ones that go together. So a statistic is going to be a number that describes a sample. And as you might have guessed, the thing that we work with in this class is going to be the statistics, because we know that collecting parameters is really, really difficult. So for these examples down here, we are going to identify the population, the parameter, the sample, and the statistic. So for our first example, a pediatrician wants to know the mean for the distribution of heights of 10-year-old boys, so she takes a sample of 50 patients and calculates that the mean in the sample is 50 inches. So the hardest thing on this is just understanding which is which. The population is going to be all 10-year-old boys. The sample, however, is going to be the 50 patients that she actually asks. And the statistic is going to be the mean from the sample, which is 50 inches. And we are going to write that as x bar equals 50. I'm going to go over the notation in the next section, but I'll just show it to you for now. So then the parameter is usually one of the hardest things to figure out. You're not usually going to actually have a numerical value for the parameter. So the parameter is actually, usually when you're asked to define it, you're just going to talk about it in words. So the parameter is going to be the mean height of all 10-year-old boys. And in this case, this one is actually very nice because it tells you what the pediatrician wants to know. So it actually specifically gives you the parameter there. So the second one, the population, they don't actually tell you what the population or the parameter is in this case, so you got to kind of figure it out. So I'm going to actually start by writing out the sample. The sample is going to be the 1,102 12 to 17-year-olds. And from that, you can assume that the population is going to be all 12 to 17-year-olds. You can do the same thing with the statistic and the parameter. So the statistic is the 71% have a cell phone. And you can use that to figure out what the parameter is. The parameter is actually the percent of all 12 to 17-year-olds who have a cell phone. So this next example is an example of a sampling distribution. So what we have here, we have somebody who removed the aces and face cards from a deck of cards so that only cards 2 through 10 remained. Then what she did was she took a look at the cards. She drew samples of size 5. With each sample, she recorded the median value of the cards. And she did this 100 times. So this below is the distribution of the sample median. Actually, usually you're going to see distributions of sample means. Pretty much everything that you would see in this class and on the AP test, but you occasionally will see something like this. So I think it's a good example to try. Okay, so for part A, we have 1 dot on the graph at 2. That's this one right here. And they ask you to explain what that value represents. And pretty much all it is going to be that out of the 100 samples that she took, one of the samples had a median of 2. So please don't overthink that question. It's supposed to be pretty straightforward. The biggest issue with students on this type of question is that they try to make it more complicated than it is. So for part B, it asks you to describe the distribution. Now, when asked to describe the distribution, this was back in chapter 1, but there are a few things you need to remember. You need to remember to mention the center. You need to mention the shape. You need to mention the spread. And you also need to mention if there's any outliers. Okay, so which they give you a hint for that one. So the center here, you can see that the center is the mean or median, which both of them are going to be about the same, is around 6. The shape is, I'm going to say it's roughly symmetric and unimodal. In fact, you can even say it's roughly normal if you want. The spread, there's a few things that you can say there. You can say most values fall between 4 and 8. You can say the values vary from 2 to 10. Anything along those lines is fine. I'm just going to say all values are between 2 and 8 and 10. So the last thing is the outlier. Be careful about that. Just because 2 is really low doesn't make it an outlier. Since there are things at 3, 2 isn't really that far away from it. Kind of follows the main shape, so there's none. All right, for C, they ask you, would it be surprising to get a sample median of 4 or smaller in an SRS of size 5 from this deck? So what we're doing is, if you look at this, 4 or smaller is actually going to be everything here. And you will notice that there's actually quite a few things. So I'm going to say no, it's not surprising. And if you actually count those dots, there are 22 of them that are 4 or less. So actually, a median of 4 or less occurred 22 out of 100, or 22% of the time. So the next thing actually is really, really important. It's going to come up again and again. Just the basic concept of it is very important. So the idea of variability is the spread of a distribution. And our most important concept in this section is that the larger the sample size, the smaller the spread, or the more narrow the spread. And so generally, if you can get a bigger sample size, that's preferred because there's going to be a lot less variability. Okay, so take a look at the next example. They tell us that the heights of adult males are approximately normally distributed with a mean of 70 inches. So there were two things that they did. They took 200 SRSs of size 100, and then they did and calculated the mean of each of those SRSs. Then they did the same thing, but then this time the sample size was 1,500. So I asked you which came from the samples of size 1,500 and which came from the samples of 100. Go ahead, take a guess on your own. You can pause if you think if you would like to. So hopefully you figured out that the one on the right is the bigger sample size, and the one on the left is the smaller sample size. And the way that we know that is because the one on the left is more spread out, and the one on the right is less spread out. So each of these dots represents one sample. And what they found when they took the mean of the bigger samples, it was a lot closer to the actual mean height of adult males. So now we're going to be talking about what an unbiased estimator is. This is, it doesn't appear that often on the AP test. However, it has appeared in the past on free response. So just make sure you know it, but it's not like the most important thing. However, I will give you one of these a question about this on a quiz at some point. So an unbiased estimator is a statistic whose mean is equal to the parameter it is estimating. So if you remember, when we take a sample, our purpose of taking a sample is to find a statistic to estimate a parameter. So in example 4, it's an example that's mentioned in your book. What they did during World War II was a bunch of Allied commanders sent some data to some mathematicians in Washington, D.C., in order to try to get these mathematicians to help them estimate the number of German tanks. So for this example, they took 250 samples of size 4. And for A, they're asking you which of the statistics appear to be biased estimators. So you might be able to guess a biased estimator is the exact opposite of an unbiased estimator. In this case, you're going to be looking for things that have a statistic not being equal to the parameter. And here, this blue line, although in your paper it might be gray or black, this line represents the actual population mean. So this is the actual mean number of tanks. And remember, the actual mean is going to be a parameter. And in case you're wondering, I put down what each of these things represents. Now, you don't need to write those down. You're not going to have to memorize any of them, but just in case you're curious. So when we're looking to figure out what biased estimators are, we're going to be looking for things where the sample statistic is not equal to the parameter. So the first one that's biased is the max. What you're going to notice is that the max is actually, it's lower than every single sample maximum they found was lower than the actual mean. Another one that is pretty biased is twice the IQR. That one's not as bad as the sample max, but every time they did 2 times the IQR, they were about, I would say about 75% of them looked like they were lower. Now, you might be saying like, oh yeah, the partition is pretty bad. The partition actually is a pretty unbiased estimator. It's pretty good. It's very much centered around the actual mean. So B is a little bit subjective. They ask you, of the unbiased estimators, which is the best? And for this one, believe it or not, it actually is, the best one is probably going to be the partition. I know you might be looking at it thinking, wow, that looks really skewed. That's not a very good estimate. But actually, you'll notice that a lot of the values were pretty close to the mean. It has the smallest spread. That's what you're going to be looking for in that one.